In this video, we'll go over the supplies needed for your paper quilling project. This video is specifically geared towards the digital patterns that I offer, so if you're not here from the pattern instructions, you might find this of some general use, but you can find the link for patterns in the description below. You'll also find more info and links for specific suggestions for most of these items in the supply guide that was included in your digital download. Each pattern might vary a little bit in the supplies that are needed, so you'll also find more details in the PDF instruction guide for your specific pattern. So while you have a lot more information in those PDFs, I hope this gives you a visual for the supplies that you'll need. Let's start with the most important thing, your quilling paper. I will start by saying that I do things a little bit differently than most quilling artists with my paper. I assume you're here though because you like my style, and it's important to me to be true to my own style and materials, so I will first explain what I use and then I'll talk a little bit more broadly about other options. The paper that I use is heavier than most quilling artists use. That's the main difference, it's heavier weight. I use a variety of paper for different purposes, but for the most part, I use cardstock strips that are 176 GSM or 65 pounds. If you're not sure what those numbers mean, it just describes the weight of the paper. The higher the number, the heavier the paper. So for example, here's the same color paper, same width, but I have it in both 24 pound and 65 pound. The 65 pound, the higher number is the cardstock and it's heavier weight. So you can kind of see how they behave. It's a little difficult to show in the video, but this is the 24 pound paper and you can see it's just kind of like flimsier, and the 65 pound paper is just a little bit more stiff. It's heavier weight. Generally speaking, I use lighter weight paper for rolling coils, and cardstock is best for outlines. Most of my patterns include on-edge work like the outline of this letter, the outline of this jar, the outline of these succulent pots, etc. So at least for the outlines, I highly recommend using heavier paper. You might find that heavier paper difficult to roll, so that's why I suggest a lighter weight paper for that, more traditional quilling paper. But as you can see on these outlines or on-edge work, this paper doesn't have the coil to support it. It's just standing up on its own, and this is going to be really difficult if your paper is flimsy. So cardstock, heavier weight paper is going to be best for these outlines or on-edge work. There's a lot of different quilling paper out there though, and you can use whatever came in your kit or whatever you prefer. I find that every artist kind of has their own preferences, so whatever came in your kit is a good place to start. But as you run out of that paper, and especially if you want to make on-edge work easier for yourself, I highly recommend adding heavier paper strips to your supplies as you go. Okay, a couple more things on paper before we move on. I use different widths of paper for different projects as well. For example, this monogram has 1/2-inch strips and this mason jar bouquet has 1/4-inch strips. You can see the difference in how high the paper comes off the backing. You can use any width of paper that you like as well. For example, here's my succulent design, and in my example, I use 1/2-inch strips, but here's what it looks like with 1/4-inch strips. You could also use even smaller strips like 3mm or 1/8 inch. In general, I use wider strips for larger framed artwork and smaller strips for smaller, more delicate projects like greeting cards. More details on paper width can be found in your PDF instruction guide for your specific pattern. You can use the same width that I do in my example, or you can change it up based on the paper you have on hand or based on your personal preferences. And then the last thing on paper is just the color choices. You'll find details on colors in your PDF instruction guide or just by looking at the example of your pattern. And again, you can either follow mine exactly or change up the colors to make it your own. I encourage you to make variations you'd like to add your own personal spin to it. Okay, the next most important item is your quilling tool. This is the other main area where I do things a little bit differently than most. And then I promise after this, the tools are gonna get more easy and standard. So the main two quilling tools are the slotted tool and the needle tool. The slotted tool is what most people use, and it's significantly easier because that slot helps grip the paper and makes it easier to roll. However, this tool has its limitations. You can see that with this wider strip, it doesn't work well. It's just too short. I can kind of roll it, but it's not really working out. This is also heavier weight paper now that I'm showing, and it's too thick to even fit into the tool. So when I started using wider paper and heavier paper, I learned to use my needle tool, which can be used for any width and any weight of paper. On the other hand, the needle tool is a little bit more difficult if your paper is lighter weight and a smaller width. Because it doesn't have that slot to grip onto the paper, it actually makes it a little bit more difficult to roll and isn't really necessary with this lighter weight and smaller width of paper. As you work through the instructions for your pattern, you'll find videos for each of the shapes in your design, and I show in the videos how to make each shape with a different tool so that you can decide for yourself. Depending on the paper you're using and your own preferences, you can choose which one you might use, or you might use both. For traditional lighter weight paper and smaller widths, the slotted tool is easier, and for wider and heavier paper, you'll need to use the needle tool. Alright, I told you it would get more straightforward now. You'll need craft tweezers. Yours might be fine pointed or round or angled. It really doesn't matter, though sometimes I need these fine pointed ones to get into small spaces, but these round ones have a better grip on them, so I do keep a variety in my toolkit for various purposes. And if you want to add more to your kit, I have recommendations in your supply guide, but whatever your kit came with is perfectly fine. You'll also need scissors. Any scissors will do, though the smaller the better because you'll be working in small spaces. I am obsessed with these from Fiskars. Truly, it was a game changer and one of my favorite things when I added these to my kit. They're so easy to grab because they don't have loops on the handles that you have to get your fingers through to pick them up, and they're spring-loaded so they stay open. That may not sound like a huge deal, but when you're reaching for your scissors a million times during a project, they're just so much easier to grab. Another thing that's perfect about these is that they really close all the way at the tip. So a lot of what we will do is you might have a piece of paper that's glued down like this, and you need to go in and cut off the excess paper. These have a fine point that cuts all the way through. By contrast, you can see that these don't quite come to a fine point, so they don't really cut all the way through. It's not the biggest thing, but it's a little detail that makes a difference in the long run. These came in the Julia kit and they're perfectly fine to start with, but if you're really getting into this craft, I can't recommend these highly enough. All right, let's talk glue. You need some kind of liquid glue. I've tried a ton of different glues, but for me, nothing beats Aleene's tacky glue for quilling. If you have Elmer's or another liquid glue on hand, that's fine too. Every quilling artist kind of has their preference, so use whatever you like, but Aleene's is on the thicker side, so generally I water it down just a little bit, which makes it easier to work with. I don't have exact ratios on that, just a little bit of water. I also work with both the big bottle of glue and then I keep some in a needle tip bottle like this. You will need to apply small amounts of glue in some way, so this needle tip bottle will allow you to apply small amounts. If you don't have a needle tip bottle like this, you can grab a paper plate and a toothpick, squeeze some glue out onto the plate and use the toothpick to apply small amounts. Now in the needle tip bottle, if you're using Aleene's, it is way too thick for this tiny nozzle, so it definitely needs watered down in here. Again, no exact ratio, but this bottle needs more water than what I put in the big bottle. Just add a little bit of water at a time and really give it a good shake and a good mix until it comes out smoothly but not watery. I also keep my glue in a setup like this. This is a shot glass, but you could use a votive candle holder or any small container like this. I keep it upside down with a damp paper towel at the bottom. You could also use like a sponge. The paper towel keeps it from drying out, and keeping it upside down makes the glue ready to go at the tip of the nozzle. Again, something that may not sound like a big deal, but when you're picking up your glue a million times in a project, it's frustrating and takes extra time to pick it up and shake the glue down. This setup keeps it ready to go, so you just pick it up and the glue comes right out. You will also need a glue palette, which might sound fancy, but it's just a flat surface to spread your glue on. A paper plate works, or some people use a large lid from like an oatmeal container. Of course, wash it first. I use this plastic sheet, which I think is for a picture frame, but somehow it made its way into my art supplies. The benefit of plastic for this purpose is that when the glue dries, it can just peel off, and then I can keep reusing this sheet, unlike a paper plate. You'll also need something to spread glue with. I use a craft squeegee, though you could also use an old gift card or anything in your workspace to create this effect. I have this plastic box in my storage supplies, and the little dividers in here are also just the right size and shape for this sort of thing. So look around your space, get creative. You're going to need to spread the glue thin onto your glue palette like this, so whatever you can find to achieve this sort of effect. Depending on your project, you might need a ruler and a pencil. They're good to have on hand. And then let's talk about backing, which is whatever you're going to glue your project onto. I recommend either a blank card, cardstock cut to the size of the project, or a solid sheet of mat board cut to size. A blank card is a great option for smaller projects, though obviously it won't work for things like this 8x10 monogram. Cardstock is also great because you can cut it to any size. You want to look for heavier weight paper like this cardstock that's 300 GSM or 110 pounds. You want really heavy weight paper for your backing because when you add glue, it will warp and bend, but heavier paper will be more sturdy and will handle it better and won't warp as much. And then my favorite material for most projects is a solid sheet of mat board. This is the same material that you see as a border in picture frames, but for this purpose, it's a solid sheet, not with the middle cut out. You can see that this material is sturdy, so when you add glue to it, it's not going to bend or warp at all. So it can really handle your quilling project with all the glue. Then the best of both worlds, it's still thin enough that it's pretty easy to frame if you'd like to do that. You'll find more information about the size of your project in your PDF instruction guide so that you can make sure to get backing that's the right size. The first step of your project will be to either print, trace, or score the design onto your backing. You'll find another video about how to do that in your PDF instruction guide, along with the transfer files and the files that you receive for the pattern. For most patterns, there are some elements that you will need to transfer by either printing, tracing, or scoring, and others that you will not. For example, on this mom heart, you'll transfer the outline of the heart and the letters. Then there are 3 reference dots to get the center of the flowers placed right. For the mason jar bouquet, for example, you'll transfer just the outline of the jar. The reason for that is that the heart and letters or the jar, whichever element it is, needs to be a specific shape and would be impossible to freehand. The other elements, however, like flowers, are a little more freeform. They don't have to be exact. Nature isn't perfect, so you can kind of go with the flow. You'll use the reference image to create those, and it'll all make more sense once you dive into the instructions for your specific design. Depending on the pattern you're doing, most come with a reference image that will need to be printed out. You won't quill directly on this, but you'll use it to measure and shape your pieces. That will become more clear once again when you start working through the instructions. Make sure that when you print this, your printer settings are at 100%. If it's scaled up or down, your dimensions will be too big or too small. And then this is optional, but I use a clean paintbrush in a glass like this with another damp paper towel at the bottom. I only put water on the bottom of the paper towel and then I drape the rest of it up over the edge of the glass. The reason for that is that if I get a little too much water in there, the rest is going to be drawn up on the side of the paper towel, which just keeps it at the perfect level of dampness. If it's too wet, you're going to end up tearing your paper, which obviously you don't want. I use this to clean up glue as I go. I get the paintbrush a little bit wet by rubbing it on the paper towel, then running it along the side of my paper to get off extra glue. Hopefully the glue that you're using should dry clearly, but you can still see it if there are big spots of glue, so it's just best to get it when it's wet, and this is the best method that I've found to keep your project clean as you go. The paintbrushes don't have to be fancy. I think I got these from like the kids section of the store, as long as they're clean. Alright, that's all for supplies. Again, you can find more details for what's needed for your specific project in your PDF instruction guide, as well as the supply guide that was included in your download files. Have fun and happy quilling!